digitally. But if the panelists would come up here and take their seats, that would be great. And anybody who wants to come closer to the front, as obviously you can. I'm Linda Wertheimer. I'm from National Public Radio. So you have a radio lady running the panel. And that means that we will get off on time. So I'm hoping that we won't get too far behind. So everybody, more seats down front if you want to take them. Now let me just say that we have a very distinguished group of people who will be talking to us today. The panelists will each have a period to sort of explain their general thinking about what is going on. And then we will have questions, and there will be an opportunity for questions from the audience and from the online audience. So we have quite a bit of ground to cover during the course of the next roughly hour and a half. And we are going to begin by suggesting that the topic, Ending Poverty, How Should the World Bank Group Measure Its Contribution? We're going to begin, let me just begin by introducing the panel. Arsenio Balisacan, who is here, Socioeconomic Planning Secretary, Director General of National Economic and Development Authority in the Philippines. He was previously Dean of the Philippines School of Economics. And then we have also Stefan Durkan, who is Chief Economist for the Department of International Development of the United Kingdom. He is a development economist who applies microeconomics and statistics to the problems of development. And then Professor Nora Lustig, who is the Samuel Z. Stone Professor of Latin American Economics at Tulane University. She is also a non-resident fellow at the Center for Global Development and the Inter-American Dialogue in Washington, D.C., and Martin Revillian, who some of you world bankers will probably remember very well because he was previously director of the World Bank's Research Department, the Development Research Group. He is now the Edmund D. Villani Professor of Economics at Georgetown University. So please welcome our panel. And we are very happy to have Caroline Hyder, who is IEG's Director General, with us here this morning, to welcome all of you. But before that happens, you may have noticed, if you didn't sit on it, that you all have little clickers. Now these clickers are intended to basically to introduce the audience to the panel, so that people will, we will get a feeling for who you are and where you come from and the kinds of things that interest you. So, as you can see, this first question, how long have you traveled to get here? This is a warm-up question, so you can learn how to use this clever little tool here, the clicker. So, answer number 1, less than an hour. Number 2, 1 to 4 hours. Number 3, 4 to 8 hours. Number 4, I'm so jet-lagged I can't remember. And number 5, the plaint of the world traveler, where am I? So, everybody, one quickly click. That's so funny to see. All right. Almost all of our crowd here is either from, I dare say, in the building or somewhere in the academic reaches around the building, I betcha. But we do have a couple of people who can't remember. This panel, this discussion is, this question is about your background. I think you can probably read this for yourself, but there are only 3 choices. Do you devise policies? Are you measuring and tracking policies? Or do you lobby and advocate for policies? So pick a possibility. Is everybody voting? Do I see lots of thumbs on clickers here? Our panelists are also voting. I am not voting because my answer to all of these questions is no. All right. Professionally engaged in measuring and tracking policy outcomes. It's very interesting that comes first. And we seem to be a little short on lobbyists. I can't say that I regret that. Now, the technical background that would be that would imply is very interesting for our panelists to know. And the next question is, in answering the big picture question, how should the World Bank Group measure its contribution to ending poverty? What would be your thinking on that? You have three choices. Stop wasting our time. Outcomes can be measured, but the progress is the countries and not the World Banks. And poverty and prosperity outcomes can be measured and can be attributed to the World Bank. So that third one is a kind of a complicated one. I'm betting it doesn't get very many votes. Oh, I'm wrong. That's really interesting. We would say in political statistics, we would not call that a tie, but we would say that was, liable to be in a crowd this size, well within the margin of error. Okay, the bank's goal of reducing extreme poverty to 3% of the world's population by 2030. What do you think of the goal? Much too ambitious? Ambitious with a good chance? Realistic? Not ambitious enough? Seriously not ambitious enough? This one is, I think we're really reaching out to the technicality folks here, to the people who understand how these things should be measured. Okay. Ambitious but with a good chance of success. I think this is, I would say that if I were working here and thinking of that as a possible goal, I would be very encouraged by that. 65%, well, more than that, almost 70% are saying, I take it back, 60 say that it can be done. And others think it can be done sooner. More than 70% are down with this goal. I guess if that's the business you're in, that's a good thing. Now, while we will all ponder this information and ask Carolyn Hyder to introduce the discussion and tell us why we are having this event.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this event. Really pleased to see you all here, and very pleased to know that there are many online listeners who will participate also via our social media and ask questions that we will feed into the discussion. Let me start with many of you might have read the Financial Times article of a couple of days ago, where the Financial Times really asked the question about whether the World Bank contributions to achieving the twin goals, and Linda referred to them, the 3% by 2030, the shared prosperity, can be achieved, and whether, more importantly, whether we could tell whether the World Bank contribution could be measured. Can we actually see what the bank group is, how it's making a difference? And that would be the ultimate test, whether it actually is relevant to the future. And this is exactly why we are organizing this event. And when I say we, this is a combined effort of the Vice Presidencies of Development Economics, of the Poverty Reduction and Economic Management Vice Presidency, and the Independent Evaluation Group, IEG. And we have this combination because we really want to look at the question from the research angle, from the operationalization, as well as from the evaluation angle. Now, given the audience outcome, I think the question, why do we need to do this, is almost mute, because so many of you are in the same business as we are, and so you might think, like, why ask it? But nonetheless, it is important to think about that. One is that achieving these goals is quite tough, even though we had a lot of people thinking that this is our realistic goals, and maybe and few people thought they were not realistic enough. It is nonetheless a tough challenge that will require a lot of resources get really focused and channeled towards achieving these goals. And there is the question of accountability. At the end of the day, the World Bank Group and the development community at large spend a considerable amount of resources. They're dedicated institutions to make contributions to these objectives, and we will want to and have to account for what we have done. So why do this right now? I mean, 2030 is a long time away. Why can't we just sort of like go along and figure it out and then afterwards try to establish the contributions? Well, we have seen that unless we establish some baselines, unless we establish how we measure, we will, first of all, not be able to tell the difference at the end. We will also maybe not focus our resources in the right way. Some people feel like having clear objectives is sufficient to rally the efforts towards those goals. That is true, but if they are so far out and so large, making the connection between what I do today and those goals needs to be broken down into something that is more measurable, where I can understand what my contribution is. The second reason is that in order to achieve these goals, we have to have shorter learning loops. We have to be observing, monitoring, measuring whether the right things are happening and whether the interventions are having the effects we hope they would have in order to make mid-course corrections. And this is very much in line with what the World Bank Group's Solutions Bank is supposed to look like. But finally, there is a third dimension that is really important, and that links to, and maybe some of you were in the audience yesterday when the discussion was about the data revolution. All of this has to be linked into the measurement systems, the statistical capacity development efforts, in order to make sure that the right information is collected at the right time. And so we have some very critical questions here. One is about the goals are obviously about countries' progress. Can we measure what the World Bank Group's contributions are to achieving these or not? We have the goal of extreme poverty, $1.25 a day. How will we assess non-monetary dimensions of poverty eradication? Shared prosperity is something where we need to have or develop a common definition and a common understanding, and then form ways of actually working towards that. And finally, last but not least, and very importantly, how will this be done in a sustainable manner so that we do not share prosperity today at the cost of future generations? So with all these very complex questions, I'm very pleased to have such a distinguished panel and an excellent moderator in Linda. So back to you.
Thank you very much, Caroline. I think these questions are obviously, for somebody like me, daunting to think about. I am very impressed with the people who are here to discuss them, and we're going to start with a sort of general discussion of the goals by each of our panelists of some of the questions that Caroline just raised. Specifically, the question we've asked our panelists to consider for a sort of opening statement. There are more seats down front. I know people in the World Bank love to sit in the front row. Isn't that right? The World Bank has set itself two goals, as you know, in this project. To reduce the percentage of people living on less than $1.25 a day to 3% by 2030, which, of course, is not very far away. and to foster income growth of the bottom 40% of the population in every developing nation. The bank's resources, of course, are minuscule compared to the $22 trillion economy of the developing world. So what does it mean, in practical terms, for the bank to set itself such goals? What would be a fair indicator against which the bank group might be held accountable? So both the goals and the possibility of evaluation are part of this first question, and I'm going to ask Secretary Balisacan of the Philippines to start.
Thank you.
And after this, I get to call you Arsenio, right?
Right. Thank you. It's a very tough question. It presumes that that somehow we already know what the contribution of the bank is to poverty reduction globally. Perhaps you may know, but I don't know. So I would like to contextualize my response to the question in the following way. I'd like first to look at the comparative advantage of the bank as seen from an outsider's perspective. I'd like to think that the bank has this unique wealth of knowledge, experience, and expertise in poverty reduction, particularly on what works and what does not in that area. It has the unique capacity to mobilize and organize talents and expertise for the generation of global public goods, including knowledge that advances our understanding of the dynamics of poverty reduction. The question to me then is, how can the bank best mobilize this comparative advantage? Improving the access of developing countries, especially the least developed ones, to this reservoir of expertise, or the so-called global practices, is therefore key to understanding the contribution of the bank to poverty reduction. Although we should recognize that one-size-fits-all approach to poverty reduction hardly works in practice. So what we mean by spreading global practices to me is still a open question. Nonetheless, helping local capacities in policy analysis, program management and administration, monitoring and evaluation is key to advancing poverty reduction in these least developed countries or the developing countries in general. If the bank focuses on developing the local supply side and not importing consultants all the time, perhaps we could we even have a better chance of ensuring that poverty reduction is there to stay. My point then is that if we can leverage the bank's expertise and limited resources towards and capacitating, enabling least developed countries by bringing in what their comparative advantages are vis-a-vis the developing countries, then I might think that or one could argue that the bank could contribute to poverty reduction, and the goal might be realizable. Given that, and that the fact that my observation, at least in the region where I come from, is a lot of the poverty reduction that you saw there is coming from the efforts of governments, and one can argue to what extent institutions like the World Bank or the UN or other multilateral institutions could have contributed to that. But I do think that the bank, at least for the least developed countries, could have contributed much. And so for fairness sake and for in practical terms, I would think that if you would want to get the bank accountable, I think seeing the monitoring the performance of at least the least developed countries or even the lower developing countries with still high proportion of extreme poverty might be a relevant target group for monitoring for purposes of getting the bank accountable to what it's aiming to achieve for that 3% poverty reduction of extreme poverty.
Thank you very much. So that's a sort of a not entirely optimistic view of what can be done. And let's turn now to Stefan Durkan, who is from the United Kingdom.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Let me try to make 3 points here. But first, actually say, from the point of view of the organization I represent, but also just myself, I love these goals. It's pretty good to have them. But I want to ask, first of all, why do you have goals? And let's think a little bit about it, briefly reflect on the issues of indicators and measurement, and then actually quickly come to the kind of final point on, this whole question of attribution that was raised earlier. So very quickly, why goals? Organizations like to have goals and targets and visions and mission statements and so on. So we could use them in all kinds of ways. And I would say there's at least 3 different ways. You could focus largely as a way of communications. You could have basically at something that is really good when your senior people go around and talk. I'm a little bit worried about that. When I came 15 years ago to the bank the first time, I do remember the stickers in the lift, the world free of poverty. I see that there's much nicer graphics in the lift now, but it's again, beautiful graphics. Surely we don't do it just for communications. If we're going to do something more, we have to think much more carefully, why do you have goals? And I would say there's 2 more reasons we can have them. It's because we want to provide incentives, not to the rest of the world, but to ourselves. And secondly, we want to be held accountable. So on both these factors, it's really important to think a little bit further about this. Now, to come to the second point, indicators. Is that really the key thing that we should start with entirely? Of course we need them. We need to do it. But one of the risks we have is that we start directly from communications to having indicators, and actually very little link with anything we do. It's a bit like the poverty literature in the academic world. I have worked on the academic world also on measurement and so on, but 95% of the literature is about measurement. Virtually nothing is about what shall we do about it. And even less so, how shall we incentivize actors to actually act in the interest of reducing poverty. So, we have to be a bit careful that we don't reduce this entirely to just a set of indicators. And so the third point is then, what should we do? And that's really this big question of attribution. This big question of attribution, although I was warned by the moderator, never question the question, but I think it's just the wrong word. Attribution, it reminds me very much of, some of you may know this play, A Question of Attribution. It's quite an interesting play, but it's basically about an art historian who turned out to be a spy. But it all was a discussion about, what is the individual's role in reaching something bigger. Similarly, if you think of a piece of art or at a building, are we really going to try to identify each builder's contribution very exactly to the whole part of it? We need to find ways of doing it, and everybody's role is there very important, so we have to think about it. So it's about it's about contribution, not just trying to just naively attribute. And so 2 levels, I think it's important. And I think if for the bank these goals are really going to mean something, it's at the first level in terms of selectivity. The bank, if it is a bank, it will have loan officers that will have to think carefully about why should we lend. And if the lending officers, if the criteria is that in the end the goal has to be attained, then they really has to do very careful ex-ante analysis. Is this going to contribute to this goal directly or indirectly? And so you need to really up your game in terms of really thinking carefully about, will this really contribute? And that's ex-ante. And it's very important. It means selectivity. If we want to bring poverty down to 3% in the world, we'll have to start thinking seriously about what's happening in the DRC. We can't just ignore the DRC, but we have to really think carefully about some of the worst places on Earth where very little seems to be happening, but you're not going to get 3% unless you turn around to DRC or indeed a whole series of fragile states. But it's the loan officers who will have to think very carefully to what extent are my actions going to contribute to poverty. And that's in terms of the incentives. It was already alluded to, that the loan officers will have to think carefully about, shall we give the loans to the right kind of things? And can we have a real thinking about how they will contribute to the goals? And will we be able to course correct and adapt and be flexible in terms of when things are happening? And then the final one, it's a point of accountability. If we have goals, they're not just about incentives ex ante, they also have to be something about accountability. And it's really about, as an organization, wanting to be accountable and being willing to accountable to actually be just, in the end, did it really contribute to these things? It's not about, did we reach 3% as a whole, but did the actions we did, the loans we gave, the policies we recommended, were they actually instrumental? And that means, extremely careful evaluation, extremely careful assessment, and being willing to actually being critical whether these things were actually contributing or not. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm astounded to have two contributors essentially from the political world who are on time. I'm obsessed with time and just have to overlook that. And now we're going to move on to, excuse me, to Nora Lustig from Tulane University.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And I am going to ask a different question. In a way, it's very linked, but it's different. I think, we're continuously thinking about what can the bank do or how will we measure its contribution to reducing poverty. I want people to start asking, how can we prevent the bank from increasing poverty? Because I think that in the history of the bank, we find instances in which its contribution was negative, and it can happen again. And I think that is much easier, actually, than trying to understand what's the link of the World Bank to reducing poverty. And I'm going to give you 3 examples. In '95, Mexico had a huge crisis in which GDP per capita fell around 10% and poverty increased tremendously. And one of the reasons why Mexico had a crisis was because previously there had been a financial liberalization, a capital account liberalization, without adequate prudential regulation in the financial sector. The World Bank was part of the multilateral institutions that had been recommending Mexico, going along with the Mexican government, that it was a good idea to privatize the banking system and liberalize the external account. And when the things went awry, then there was an evaluation, by the way, by the Office of Evaluation. Then I was part of that team, so I remember that we looked at that as one of the problems. And so crises are one of the main causes of increases in poverty. So the bank has to be very careful when it works together with the IMF, what things it supports so that it doesn't create conditions for future crises. That's first. Second, the bank participates a lot, and this is more sort of a current one, in reforms, austerity programs, etc. And now we have one in Ukraine, right? And I read in the Financial Times, I haven't seen the letter of intent of the IMF, so I don't know if I know all the details, but I know it recommends reducing or eliminating energy subsidies. We know that the Ukraine is under a little bit of pressure to probably do that, but I think it's very important that when those recommendations are put in place, the bank should have everything ready to see, okay, what is going to be the effect on the poor? How many of the poor will be impoverished? What are the mechanisms to compensate? Are they part of the package? Are the resources there to actually compensate the losers who are poor or those who are not poor and will become poor if you don't compensate? 2. Third, another discussion that's going on very vividly now is that you want countries more and more to rely on domestic resource mobilization and replace domestic resources because foreign aid is going to be cutting down, and external resources are becoming less accessible. Now, I think that we need to make a very careful analysis of who is going to pay for these domestic resources. When you do that replacement,